Picture this. It's the summer of 1871, and the Chiricahua Mountains are blazing under a sun that could melt copper pennies. Young Kewekla, maybe 13 years old, still growing into the warrior he'd become, crouches behind a boulder that's probably been sitting in this exact spot since before Christ walked the earth. His heart is hammering against his ribs as he watches dust clouds rise from the valley below, those telltale signs that mean one thing and one thing only: cavalry. Now, think about what 13 means to you. Maybe it's middle school awkwardness. Maybe it's the first time someone trusted you with real responsibility. For Kewekla, 13 meant survival depended on how fast he could run, how quietly he could move, and how quickly his people could disappear into landscape that looked like God had been experimenting with different shades of brown and red. His band, 43 souls, and yes, I'm counting every man, woman and child because each one mattered, had fled their camp at dawn. Picture the chaos. Families grabbing what they could carry, leaving behind half-constructed tipis that represented days of back-breaking work. These weren't just shelters, folks. These were homes that would have taken 2 more full days to complete properly. 2 days they didn't have. This was the 3rd abandoned camp in 7 days. Think about that for a moment. Imagine packing up your entire life, finding a new place to live, starting to build your home from scratch, and then having to run again before you've even finished. And again, and again. That's the reality these people lived with every single day. As those horses thundered closer, and cavalry horses at full gallop sound like the end of the world. When you're the one being hunted, Kewekla's grandmother Nana did something that tells you everything you need to know about Apache resilience. Even as terror gripped the camp, even as mothers grabbed children and men checked their side, weapons. This weathered old woman kept clutching the sacred sinew she'd been preparing when the scouts first spotted those soldiers. Sacred sinew. Let me tell you about this stuff, because it's going to matter later. This wasn't just thread or rope like you'd buy at a hardware store. This was deer tendon, carefully prepared through a process that took weeks, blessed with prayers that had been passed down through generations, stretching back to when Europe was still figuring out which end of a sword to hold. Nana was whispering the ancient construction prayers over this sinew, even as the world around her collapsed into chaos and flight. And that's when something extraordinary happened. In this moment of pure terror, as dust clouds grew larger and horse hooves grew louder, something shifted in young Kewekla's mind. It was like lightning striking, except this lightning illuminated not the landscape but an idea, a revelation about angles and time that would transform how his people survived. Now, Kewekla hadn't grown up planning to revolutionize Apache architecture. He'd grown up among what I like to call the master builders, though you've probably never heard them called that before. These were the women of his tribe, and let me be clear about something. When we talk about Apache women, we're talking about engineers who could read the sky's moods in how lodge poles swayed in the wind, who knew 27 different knots for 27 different wind conditions, who could look at a piece of land and tell you whether it would drain properly in a flash flood or turn into a muddy death trap. Through young Kewekla's eyes, growing up in this world meant experiencing the intricate 3-day ritual of traditional tipi raising. And when I say ritual, I don't mean some quick ceremony. I mean a precisely choreographed dance of engineering and spirituality that would make modern construction crews weep with envy. Each of the 12 poles required specific prayers and exact placement. We're talking about measurements that had been refined over centuries, angles that had been tested by countless storms, positioning that meant the difference between a shelter that could withstand 60-mile-per-hour winds, screaming across the high desert, and a pile of broken wood that would leave your family exposed to elements that could kill you in a single night. The covering hides buffalo when they could get them, elk or deer when they couldn't, needed 72 separate lashing points. 72. Count that out sometime, and imagine tying each one correctly while your hands are freezing and the wind is trying to tear the hide from your grip. A single mistake, one knot tied wrong or one lashing point missed, and the whole structure could collapse when those desert storms hit. And those storms? They're not like the gentle rains you might be used to. High desert weather is violent and unpredictable. Flash floods can appear from clear skies. Winds can shift from dead calm to gale force in minutes. Temperatures that will bake you alive during the day can drop below freezing before dawn. The difference between a properly constructed tipi and an inadequate one wasn't comfort, it was life and death. So here's young Kewekla, raised in this tradition of precision and skill, watching his people flee yet again from an enemy that could move faster than they could build. And as he crouched behind that boulder, listening to his grandmother whisper prayers over sacred sinew while cavalry horses thundered closer, something clicked in his mind. The question that would change everything was simple. What if there was a better way? Not a way that abandoned tradition. Kewekla understood the sacred nature of these practices better than anyone. But what if innovation could serve tradition? What if adaptation could preserve, rather than destroy, the wisdom of his ancestors? As those dust clouds grew larger and the sound of pursuit grew closer, Kewekla was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything his people thought they knew about survival, construction, and the delicate balance between honoring the past and securing the future. But that cavalry was getting closer, and this story of innovation was about to collide head-on with the brutal mathematics of warfare in the American Southwest. What happened next would determine whether Kewekla's revelation about angles and time would save his people, or whether it would die with them in the dust of another abandoned camp. Now, before we dive into how Kewekla was about to turn Apache engineering on its head, we need to understand exactly what he was up against. The traditional Apache tipi wasn't just some random arrangement of sticks and hide. This was 500 years of accumulated wisdom, refined through countless generations of trial and error, perfected by people whose lives literally depended on getting it right. Think about that timeline for a moment. 500 years. When these construction techniques were being developed, Europeans were still debating whether the Earth was round. While Columbus was getting lost trying to find India, Apache women were perfecting mathematical principles that would make modern engineers nod with respect. Women like Kewekla's grandmother Nana held this knowledge not in books or blueprints, but in their muscle memory. They could feel when the angle of the primary poles was exactly 54 degrees, not 53, not 55, but 54. Why? Because centuries of experience had proven that 54 degrees distributed weight perfectly across the buffalo hide covers, created the optimal balance between wind resistance and interior space, and provided the exact pitch needed for rain runoff in desert cloudbursts. The spiral pattern they used to lash those hides wasn't decorative. It was engineering brilliance. Each spiral distributed stress across the entire structure, preventing any single point from bearing too much load. When those 60-mile-per-hour winds came screaming across the high desert, that spiral pattern meant the difference between a home that flexed and survived and a disaster that left families exposed to elements that could kill them before morning. And that precious sinew Nana had been preparing, this stuff was the Apache equivalent of high-tech materials. Deer tendons, properly prepared, could last decades. They stretched just enough to absorb shock without snapping, contracted in wet weather to maintain tension, and held their strength through temperature swings that would destroy any rope made by white settlers. But here's the brutal reality that was reshaping everything. By 1870, Colonel George Crook had figured out how to turn the Apache advantage against them. His new mobile tactics were devastatingly simple. Instead of trying to track Apache bands through terrain where every rock and cactus could hide a warrior, Crook's cavalry units just kept moving, 40 miles daily, relentlessly, like a machine that never needed to rest. Picture the mathematics of this nightmare. Apache bands needed 3 full days to establish secure camps, 1 day to find the right location, scout for water and escape routes, check for enemies. Then 3 full days to construct tipis properly, with all the prayers and precise measurements and 72 lashing points done correctly. Meanwhile, Crook's cavalry could cover 40 miles every single day, sweeping back and forth across Apache territory like a deadly broom. It was a war of arithmetic, and the numbers were crushing the Apache. But Kewekla was the kind of kid who noticed things other people missed. While adults debated strategy and counted ammunition, he was watching spiders. Specifically, he was watching how spiders rebuilt their webs after morning dew destroyed their overnight work. Now, this might sound silly to you, a 13-year-old watching bugs while his people faced extinction. But here's what he saw that others had dismissed. Spiders rebuilding their webs used diagonal supports that accomplished in minutes what took them hours with circular patterns. Instead of building outward in careful concentric circles, they threw anchor lines at angles, created triangular supports, built strength through geometry rather than repetition. During a 4-day meditation in the sacred caves of the Dragoon Mountains, and yes, 4 days of fasting and praying while your people are being hunted takes the kind of courage most of us will never understand. Kewekla experienced visions of intersecting lines that could cut construction time by 2/3. 2/3. Think about what that meant. Instead of 3 days to build a secure camp, maybe 1 day. Instead of being sitting ducks for Crook's cavalry, maybe the chance to stay ahead of pursuing soldiers. The revelation came with precise measurements, because Kewekla's mind worked like an engineer's even when he was in a spiritual trance. Instead of 12 primary poles requiring individual placement, each one positioned according to ancient protocols, each one blessed with specific prayers, 6 poles could create a stable hexagonal base. Hexagonal, nature's most efficient shape. Bees had been building hexagonal honeycomb for millions of years because 6-sided structures used the least material for the greatest strength. Kewekla was essentially rediscovering principles that would later be called biomimicry, except he was doing it in a cave while his people faced genocide. The diagonal cross-bracing he envisioned would replace dozens of horizontal lashings. Instead of that intricate spiral pattern requiring 72 tie points, his design needed only 36. Instead of using 5 people working in careful coordination, 3 people could erect these new tipis. And here's the kicker, it used 40% less sinew. 40%. In a world where every piece of deer tendon was precious, where preparing sinew took weeks of work, saving 40% wasn't just efficiency, it was survival. But Kewekla understood something that pure innovation often misses. You can't just throw away 500 years of accumulated wisdom and expect to survive. These construction techniques weren't just practical, they were sacred. They connected his people to their ancestors, to the mountain spirits, to the very identity of what it meant to be Apache. The question wasn't whether his new method would work, the mathematics were sound, the engineering principles solid. The question was whether his people would accept change radical enough to save them, or whether tradition would prove stronger than survival. As Kewekla emerged from those sacred caves, his mind blazing with visions of diagonal supports and hexagonal bases, he was about to discover that innovation, even brilliant innovation, means nothing if you can't convince people to try it. And convincing Apache elders to abandon 5 centuries of proven technique while cavalry units closed in from all directions, that was going to take more than mathematical precision and spider-inspired engineering. That was going to take diplomacy that could save a people. September 1871 was when everything came to a head. Picture Kewekla, still just a teenager, standing before a council of Apache elders who had survived more battles, endured more hardships, and accumulated more wisdom than most of us could imagine. He's about to propose that they abandon construction techniques that had kept their ancestors alive for 5 centuries. The audacity of it should have been laughable. But these weren't normal times. Elder Tarzay spoke for tradition, and his words carried the weight of mountains. The mountain spirits gave us the sacred pattern. To change it invites disaster. Think about the power of that statement. These weren't just building techniques to Tarzay, they were divine instructions, handed down by spiritual beings who had guided the Apache since time began. And Tarzay wasn't wrong to be concerned. History is littered with the bones of societies that abandoned proven methods for untested innovations. The Apache had survived Spanish conquistadors, Mexican armies, and now American cavalry precisely because they held tight to traditions that worked. Change, even brilliant change, could be another word for destruction. The debate split families right down the middle. Brothers who had fought side by side now argued across campfires. Mothers who had taught their daughters the ancient construction songs watched those same daughters question everything they'd been taught. The band was threatening to tear itself apart from within, while enemies closed in from without. But Kewekla understood something about human nature that would serve him well. He didn't demand that people choose between old and new. Instead, he proposed something that brilliant negotiators throughout history have used: a test. The solution came through careful diplomacy, proposing a practical competition overseen by medicine woman Lozan. Now, if you don't know Lozan, you need to understand who we're talking about here. She was a warrior who could fight alongside any man, a spiritual leader whose visions had saved Apache lives countless times, and most importantly for this moment, someone who commanded absolute respect from all factions. When Lozan agreed to oversee the test, both traditionalists and innovators knew the results would be accepted by everyone. Her word was law not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it through decades of keeping her people alive in impossible circumstances. The dramatic three-way competition took place as storm clouds gathered over the Peloncillo Mountains. Nature herself seemed to be setting the stage for this test of old versus new. Traditional builders, led by Taizé's daughter Guyen, began their time-honored process, chanting the ancient songs that had accompanied Tipi construction for centuries. These weren't just pretty melodies, folks. These songs served as timing mechanisms, memory aids, and spiritual protection all rolled into one. Each verse corresponded to a specific construction phase. When the song about calling the four directions ended, the poles should be positioned. When the blessing of the buffalo spirits concluded, the hides should be ready for lashing. The songs ensured that construction proceeded at the proper pace, with proper reverence, according to patterns that had proven successful for 500 years. Meanwhile, Kaiwakla's team of younger women worked in focused silence, their hands moving in the new diagonal patterns he'd taught them. Imagine the pressure on these women. They were betting their reputations, maybe their lives, on the mathematical visions of a 13-year-old boy. One mistake, one structural failure, and they'd be responsible for weakening faith in traditions that kept their people alive. Unknown to both groups, Lieutenant Charles Gatewood observed from a nearby ridge, sketching diagrams that would later appear in United States Army field manuals. The irony is staggering. While Apache women competed to perfect survival techniques, an enemy officer was documenting their methods for future military use. Innovation and espionage, tradition and exploitation, all happening simultaneously on the same piece of ground. As thunder rolled across the valley like the footsteps of giants, Kaiwakla's team completed their tipi in 14 hours. 14 hours versus the traditional 36 to 48 hours. Less than half the time, using less than two-thirds the materials, requiring fewer people. But the real test wasn't about speed, it was about survival. That night, flash floods tested all three structures with the kind of violence that only high desert weather can deliver. Picture water, rushing down arroyos that had been bone dry an hour earlier, winds that could knock a horse sideways, lightning that turned darkness into strobing daylight, and rain that fell not in drops but in sheets. When dawn broke and the storm cleared, only the traditional and new method tipis were still standing. The hybrid attempt where builders had tried to combine old and new techniques without fully understanding either had collapsed into a tangle of broken poles and torn hide. The lesson was clear. Half measures killed. Either trust the old ways completely or embrace the new ones fully, but mixing methods without understanding them was a recipe for disaster. At dawn, Lozan emerged from prayer with a pronouncement that would echo through Apache history. The Thunder Beings have spoken. 2 paths forward are better than 1. Think about the wisdom in those words. Lozan wasn't declaring victory for innovation over tradition or vice versa. She was recognizing that in a world where survival itself was under threat, having multiple proven methods increased their chances of keeping the Apache people alive. But acceptance by the council was only the beginning. Now Kaiwakla and his supporters had to prove that innovation could spread through Apache society without destroying the cultural bonds that held them together. And out there in the desert, Colonel Crook's cavalry was still advancing, 40 miles every day, relentless as death itself. The clock was still ticking, and time was running out for all of them. The adoption of Kaiwakla's method spread through Apache bands like ripples on water, though not without the kind of resistance that makes you understand why change, even life-saving change, never comes easy. By winter 1871, Victorio's band had modified the technique for their larger family groups, adding reinforcing elements that maintained the speed advantage while accommodating 15 to 20 people instead of the traditional 8 to 10. But Geronimo's followers? They initially rejected it as weak man's building. Now, before you judge Geronimo too harshly, understand where he was coming from. This was a man who had lost his mother, wife, and children to Mexican soldiers. His trust in anything that deviated from proven Apache ways had been burned out of him by tragedy and betrayal. When survival meant everything, why risk unproven methods? The turning point came during the disastrous winter campaign of 1872. Picture the kind of winter that kills temperatures dropping to 20 below zero, winds that cut through buffalo hide like it was paper, snow that buried landmarks and turned familiar territory into a white maze of death. Bands using traditional construction lost 17 people to exposure after having to abandon camps when cavalry approached. 17 souls, including children and elders whose names were remembered in Apache prayers for generations afterward. These weren't just statistics, they were grandmothers who carried centuries of oral history, children who represented the future of the Apache people, parents whose deaths left families shattered and incomplete. Meanwhile, bands using the swift method saved every soul, every single person. When cavalry dust appeared on the horizon, they could break camp and rebuild elsewhere in hours instead of days. The mathematics of survival had shifted decisively toward innovation. That's when even Geronimo's people began to quietly adopt elements of Kewekler's technique, not all at once, not with fanfare, but gradually, as practical necessity overcame ideological resistance. Because ideology, no matter how deeply held, means nothing when your children are freezing to death. But here's where this story gets really interesting, and where you start to see the long-term implications of what Kewekler had discovered. Beyond the immediate military advantages, his innovation preserved Apache culture in ways nobody could have predicted. When Indian agents banned traditional dwellings on reservations in 1885, claiming they promoted what they called savage lifestyle, Apache families found themselves facing cultural extinction through architectural prohibition. The government understood something that modern people often miss. Controlling how people live controls how they think. Destroy traditional housing, and you destroy traditional ways of life. But Apache families using Kewekler's technique could erect modified tipis overnight for ceremonies, then dismantle them before morning inspection. The same speed that had once meant escape from cavalry now meant preservation of sacred rituals under the noses of Indian agents who were trying to erase Apache identity completely. Think about the beautiful irony here. Innovation designed for military survival became the key to cultural survival. The techniques that helped Apache warriors stay ahead of cavalry helped Apache families stay connected to their spiritual traditions, despite government efforts to destroy them. The influence spread far beyond Apache territory. By 1878, Lakota scouts working for the army had observed and adapted these techniques. By 1880, Comanche bands were using modified versions, and eventually, in the early 1900s, civilian camping equipment design began incorporating principles that could be traced directly back to a 13-year-old Apache boy watching spiders rebuild their webs. But the real measure of an innovation's value isn't in how far it spreads, it's in how long it endures. Today, at cultural centers from Arizona to New Mexico, elder teachers like Ellen Kewekler's great-great-granddaughter demonstrate both traditional and swift construction methods to young Apache people who are trying to understand their heritage in a modern world. Ellen will tell you that learning both techniques isn't about choosing between old and new. It's about understanding that Apache wisdom has always included knowing when to hold tight to tradition and when to adapt for tomorrow's challenges. The ancestors who developed the original techniques were innovators themselves, perfecting their methods through generations of experimentation. Kewekler wasn't abandoning Apache tradition, he was continuing it. The Swift Lodge technique remains a powerful symbol in Apache communities today. It represents proof that innovation and tradition don't have to be enemies. It shows that adapting to survive doesn't mean losing who you are. And it demonstrates that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is find a better way to preserve what matters most. But perhaps most importantly, Kewekler's story reminds us that breakthrough innovations often come from unexpected sources, not from established experts or recognized authorities, but from young minds willing to question assumptions, observe carefully, and imagine different possibilities. The next time you see a spider rebuilding its web, or watch someone struggle with a problem that's always been done this way, remember the 13-year-old Apache boy who looked at centuries of proven technique and asked a simple question: what if there's a better way? That question changed everything for his people. It might just change everything for yours, too. In the end, Kewekler's legacy isn't just about architecture or military tactics or even cultural preservation. It's about the courage to innovate when innovation means survival, the wisdom to honor tradition while embracing change, and the understanding that sometimes the future depends on one person willing to see familiar problems with completely new eyes. The echoes of that summer day in 1871, when a terrified boy crouched behind a boulder watching cavalry approach, still resonate through Apache communities today, and they carry a message that transcends any single culture or time period. Survival belongs to those who can balance respect for the past with preparation for the future. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing cavalry or just trying to navigate the challenges of your own time.